Hello, and welcome to an unfortunately virtual version of my hieroglyphs. I hope to be back in version next week, but for now, you'll have to listen to about 1 hour of me talking about the Maya writing system. Remember, this is a recording. You can always take a break, get some coffee. It's going to be a lot of hieroglyphs, as the promise of the course is. So our goal for today is to describe the basics of the Maya hieroglyphic writing, how it looks, sort of, what kinds of characters we have in the Maya script. Also, from this day on, I will start our class meetings with introducing a couple of what I would call glyphs of the day. So hopefully, if you so wish, you'll be able to build up a vocabulary or a small inventory of Maya hieroglyphs that you know. And that would certainly make your life easier when you do your take-home assignments. So one of the most common signs in Maya writing is U. It is common because most of the Maya inscriptions are in third person singular. So he, she did something. And that is expressed by a prefix U on verbs, nouns, adjectives. And so you're very likely to encounter it almost in every hieroglyphic text. There are several forms of the U sign, probably because it's so common. There is a bit of variation, and in fact, in the documentary in my assignment, you've seen a lot more examples than the ones I'm showing you right now. So one of the common versions is a kind of jar with a hole in it. The neck of the jar disappears in later examples of the letter, so it looks more like the bottom part. And the jar is upside down, apparently. Then there is an even more common bracket-like variety, and sometimes you get distinct double elements looking sort of like a star, half a star inside, and those elements sometimes become stylized, so you only get like dots. And then another form of the U sign looks almost identical to a logogram for shark. There's almost no way to distinguish between the two, except when Maya write shark. They prefer to add a phonetic complement, and we'll talk more about the phonetic complements today. And just so that you know the difference, here's another common sign, ka, that you can find in spellings such as cacao. And it's also a fish, just like shark. Now, shark has a pointy nose, teeth, and a fin that is closer to the eye. So it's like one of the eye fins. I'm not sure that sharks have those, but catfish does. And many Maya scribes have never seen a real shark or monstrous shark fish in the ocean, but they've seen plenty of giant catfish varieties. And so that may explain that visual confusion. Kai is just a generic fish. The word is kai, chai in various Mayan languages. And you get the whole fish or just the tail or half a tail. Those are varieties of the sign. So before I start talking about the Maya writing system, just a few words about the language. And we'll talk more about the language, the phonology of and grammar of the language of the hieroglyphic inscriptions, of course. But I want you to get a sense of what the letters of Maya writing sound like. As you can see, a lot of consonants are similar to English. In fact, there are fewer consonants, but there are some differences. First and foremost, there is the sound ts, which is present in English, but is usually not experienced as a distinct phoneme. So we don't think of sound in its It's a class, it's a table. We don't think of that as a separate sound, as a separate distinct sound, but it is in 9 languages. So you have ts, and then of course you have the glottal stop. And yes, there are other languages like Semitic languages which have a lot more glottal stops, different glottal stops. Mayan languages, including the language of the hieroglyphs, they have only one glottal stop. So, so instead of saying say ha, they say ha. So there's like a visible stop in the flow of air, and you can add glottal stop to vowels, but you cannot also add it to consonants. You have glottalized and unglottalized pairs of consonants. Those are meaningful differences. They changed what the word actually signifies. So ka and a, these are different words. The word cook means squirrel. The word cook means quetzal. So couldn't be more different than that. That, of course, would take some time to practice. Fortunately, this is not a spoken language course, so you don't have to learn how to pronounce those things or how to hear them well when somebody speaks in a Mayan language. But you have to remember that these differences are real, that adding a glottal stop or removing a glottal stop actually changes the meaning of a word. And so it's important when you translate to make sure you remember that. Vowels, very much like in English, you get short and long vowels. So pit and peat are different words. What you do also get in Mayan languages, including the language of the hieroglyphs, is that you can get a consonant. And yes, you get a h consonant, but also a stronger h, like more velar, sort of like Spanish jota, and that's why we use a J letter for it. It doesn't mean j as in English, but rather the Spanish jota that we used to distinguish from h as in English, like home versus home. In some Mayan languages, the distinction actually collapses. And curiously, in the language of the hieroglyphs, in the Eastern Cholan language of the hieroglyphs, that distinction between h and h actually begins to collapse during the classic period. So in some 8th century texts, the scribe can no longer understand why they have 2 different h letters for everything. And so they start using them interchangeably, confusing the matters quite a bit for us. And then you can also add glottal stops, sometimes in the middle of a vowel or at the end of the vowel. But that that is hard to pronounce, but also sometimes hard to track when you read my hieroglyphic inscriptions. So just imagine that you have to pronounce something like, bak, then bak, then bag, then baak. And that would sort of give you an idea about the typical variation in vowels in the language of the hieroglyphs. So, and now writing. So writing is a logosyllabic script. As you remember, there are signs for words and there are signs for syllables. About 200 characters are common, and about 500 characters or something are consistently in use, at least in the known monuments. It is possible there are many more characters which are less common, and of which the use is less documented, in part because we're dealing only with certain genres, right? Certain kinds of texts. There are almost no semantic determinatives, so signs restricted to just meaning, no pronunciation in my writing. There are almost no auxiliary signs like commas or exclamation marks. Final consonants are spelled with syllabic signs, so some vowels are not supposed to be pronounced. And the spellings are uncommon, but they still happen. So when you actually abbreviate, you group characters into blocks, and each block has a sort of uppercase main sign and a bunch of lowercase signs around it, rather than just arranging things in a linear way. And we're going to see how it looks like today. And then some characters are rotatable, but not all, fortunately, not all, just about 100 or so. So logograms and syllabic signs. As we've seen when I talked about decipherment, you can write with words and word signs, but you can also write with syllables. So technically, if you know the syllable, you can pretty much record everything. And we do have inscriptions in the Maya area, which are just syllabic, very much like, the tale of kanji in medieval Japan, recorded entirely in syllables. Curiously, first person speech is often recorded in syllables only, as if I don't know what that person said, but in terms of what that person meant, but I can at least render what was told, like the sounds. So in this way, the author sort of distances from meaning whatsoever. So a syllabic sign only carries the phonetic value, the pronunciation. The logogram has both. It is very important to remember logograms are not ideograms. In fact, ideogram is a category that has been discarded by those who study ancient and modern writing systems. So when you want to say house in the Cholan language, the language of my hieroglyphs, there are different words for house, but you cannot spell them with the same logogram, right? So there is a house that is more like a structure, but also a social unit. And the word for that is nach. And then there is otot, which is more like dwelling, but also a container of any kind, like a box with a lid. And the word for that is otot. So you cannot use the logogram nach to spell otot, and you cannot use the logogram otot to spell na. As a matter of fact, little changes in pronunciation are possible. So say otot versus atot, you can still use the same logogram. But Yucatecan otoch is never spelled with the otot logogram, implying that that difference in pronunciation was too much. So that kind of gives an idea that Maya scribes really linked logograms to pronunciation. So some dialectal or temporal variation was permissible, but distinctly different versions of the word in, say, related Mayan languages, that was not okay to use the same logogram for those. There are almost no semantic signs, semantic determinatives, and no auxiliary signs. In fact, we have one clear semantic sign, and that's the day cartouche. So Maya 260-day calendar system comes with 20-day names and a distinct sort of circular sign around that day name. So within that cartouche, the glyphs are read in a certain way. When there is no cartouche in place, the readings are often different. It is possible that one of the two systems is older or connected to a different language. And that explains the differences in pronunciation. It also explains why you do need this cartouche to indicate to a reader that you're really talking about those days of the 260-day calendar system. And then there is a so-called doubler sign, which means read twice. But there are no commas or other auxiliary signs in my script, which means you have to pretty much guess where one sentence begins and another sentence ends. Fortunately, my languages are heavily analytical. So words are not running around inside a sentence, they actually stay in place. So it's much easier to see, to find yourself, like to know where you are in a sentence. Perhaps you don't need commas or full stops or exclamation marks as much as you do in languages like, say, German or Russian or Latin, where there's a lot more flexibility in the word order. When we publish or when we discuss a Maya text, it's very important to distinguish between the 3 T's: transcription, transliteration, and translation. So in order to understand the text, you have to be able to read it letter by letter, glyph by glyph. Then you have to understand how those glyphs correspond to actual words in a Maya language, in a reconstructed Maya language. So you have to be able to transliterate from one script to another script, from the Maya script to a modern script, and figure out what the outcome of that is. But then you have to translate to understand the word. So that is basically the full interpretation at the base level. And then, of course, you can talk about meaning and significance and context. Those be like elements of textual analysis of higher level. So we show logograms in bold uppercase. We show syllabic signs in bold lowercase. Italics is reserved for the rendering of the words as they were pronounced in the language, and then translations are given in quotation marks. So for example, here you have 2 identical pause signs, right? So you have let me try to draw it for you. So you have 2 pause signs, pause sign 1 and pause sign 2. And then you have a logogram tune right here in the middle, 1 big character, and a phonetic complement, ni, at the end. The transliteration of that would be pochtun. We know that that soft h sound is essential. It has to be there, but it's not indicated in writing. My writing does not indicate this inner h sound. So it is reconstructed. It's another layer of interpretation that we have to add. And then we decide how we want to translate it. Say stone mat or mat stone. Poch means epitate, a reed mat, and tun means rock. Now, we may actually choose not to translate it at all because it's a place name. In fact, the place name of Poptun is a town you drive through. If you drive from Guatemala City to Petén, it's a common place name. It still exists. There's several Poptuns in the Maya area. So those are higher level choices, of course, linked to translation and interpretation. So the 3 T's: transcription, transliteration, and translation. My writing uses phonetic complements, so signs which are not pronounced themselves, but are used to clarify the reading of the logogram. So phonetic complements are common in all writing systems in one way or another. Egyptian writing system routinely relies on phonetic complements. So you want to say heper for scarab, and then you can spell it as heper re, or in fact, you can actually spell it as hepe heper re, even though the need for that is not entirely clear. It looks like over complementation, over indication of the phonology of the logogram. Now, in my writing system, phonetic complements can be of 2 kinds: word final and word initial. Word final seem to function primarily to disambiguate. So you have a character that looks like a jaguar, and you read it as bahlam. Then you have a character that looks like a jaguar, and you read it as hish. That also means jaguar. These are not 2 different kinds of jaguar. These are 2 different words for jaguar. One refers to more physical jaguars, the other one more supernatural jaguars. And the supernatural one has sparkly eyes. That's the only distinction between the 2 characters. Sparkly eyes. Like cats in Japanese manga. So with that unclear and potentially problematic difference between the 2 signs, balam is often complemented by final ma right here. So you have final ma in phonetic spellings, but also next to a logogram. So when you see that ma, you know that this is balam and not hish. But hish is also complemented, but at the beginning. So you can see that there's this little knot, and that knot comes from a syllable he. Now, why is that happening? Well, it turns out that particular sound begins to drop. So instead of saying hish, people start saying ish. And the word ish also means woman, or generally a prefix indicating female gender. And so to disambiguate, because I guess the folk pronunciation becomes essentially identical, very much like English spellings with the night with K versus night without K. One is time of the day, the other one is someone in a shiny armor with a sword. So to be able to disambiguate, Maya scribes add that initial h sound, sort of emphasizing that it is there, it is supposed to be there. So those initial phonetic complements appear in response to change or disappearance of the initial consonant or vowel, and that seems to be their function. So instead of distinguishing between different similar characters which have different readings, the initial complements seem to be insisting on a certain way of pronouncing the logogram, presumably in response to changing pronunciation or regional dialects, variants. At least that's the most prevalent theory, why some signs are written with initial phonetic complements and other signs are written with final phonetic complements. Now, complements are syllabic, which means when it's a final phonetic complement, there is a vowel. And sometimes that vowel is silent, and it is also identical to the preceding vowel. So we call these syllabic phonetic complements synharmonic, right? Because there is a repetition of the vowel, as in laka for luck, maka for mak, witsi for wits, mo for mo, kutsu for kuts, and tsulu for tsul. A lot of the examples from the history of the decipherment. Now, not all phonetic complements follow that pattern. And here it gets a little complicated. There's still some debate about Maya epigraphers, what that signifies. The disharmonic phonetic complements contain different vowel. That's why they're called disharmonic. So for example, tema. Now the question is what tema stands for. Does it stand for temal, teman, just an underspelled final consonant? And it seems to be the case in some cases. Now we know, for example, that a combination like sa-ku is not sak, but instead sakun, elder sibling, elder brother usually. And so temal, on the other hand, is not temal, but most likely te'em with a glottalized vowel in the middle. Awila doesn't stand for awila, so we hope, but rather for awil with a long vowel. Putsi stands for puts and not putsil. So the idea is that the vowel here is different in the final syllable because they want to indicate that the preceding vowel is not short, but different, long, glottalized, or perhaps with a soft H embedded into it. There is still something of a debate about the precise nature of the system and the extent to which all of these examples can be explained as final syllables which underspell yet another consonant. It's not as consistent and matching what we know from linguistics as we would like it to be. but it seems that some form of indication of a special nature of the previous vowel, the preceding vowel, is what was actually happening here. We know that because some of the later spellings in the 8th and early 9th centuries AD seem to abandon the convention. We know the reason for that. In Cholan languages, some vowels which used to be glottalized or long become simple short vowels. So the scribes have all these spellings they don't know what to do with because they don't seem to indicate the way the words are actually pronounced. So instead, you have basically historic spellings, which indicate the kinds of vowels that the words actually don't contain anymore. Very much like what happened to the spellings in English. Now, many Maya scribes just continue spelling the words the old way as we do in English. But at some places, say Late Copan in Honduras, local scribes just give up and they start writing the words as they heard them. So that is the best indication we have that the so-called disharmonic spellings were indeed meant to indicate long or glottalized vowels, because there are these very late spellings which seem to abandon the principle of disharmonic phonetic complements in response to the loss of vowel length or glottalization, or as we would say, loss of vowel complexity. All vowels become short, all vowels become simple in the language, and the spellings finally, presumably not immediately, but at that particular point in time, catch up with it. Now, how do you write in Maya glyphs? In fact, it is possible to write in Maya glyphs just as we do in English, from left to right and top to bottom. So on the screen, you can see Maya hieroglyphs. And those hieroglyphs show a typical statement on a vessel. And you can see Yichi Utsibali Uhai Yukib Tatsi Tel Cacao. The surface, the decorated surface of a fine serving vessel, the drinking utensil for Citel flavored chocolate. Or as the other inscription says, Pachan Hai Yukipta Ul. Split sky fine vessel. It's a variety of vessels, presumably based on the toponym of Pachan, the split sky, perhaps the regional origin of this variety of serving bowls. The drinking utensil for corn soup, atol, known as ul in many Mayan languages. So this is pretty straightforward. It's just like we would do it. But many Maya texts are not using this system. Instead, they use a different convention that we call hieroglyphic blocks. Now imagine that instead of writing our words in the same way, I select one letter, I make it uppercase, and then I build the lowercase remaining part of the word around it rather than to the right. So these are some examples in this slide of the word house spelled using this Mayan convention. And further below, you can see the word otot, house, box, container, spelled with 3 syllabic characters, ototi, following 3 different ways of doing it. So in each variety, there is one uppercase character, uppercase variant of the character, and then 2 lowercase variants, or main sign and affix, as we would say in our way of talking about Maya glyphs. It has nothing to do with meaning. It has nothing to do with pronunciation. The pronunciation is always the same, ototi. It's just what you choose to write. And unfortunately for us, Maya calligraphy, Maya spelling rules, they don't prioritize any of the 3 versions. So all 3 are possible. which is a little confusing and kind of sad. You can also write in line, auto T, with the uppercase variants, just like on the vowels that we've seen. Now, what kinds of characters do we have? As you kind of guessed from the three examples of how to spell the word otot, most Maya characters have varieties which are small and which can be attached to an uppercase, sort of, so to speak, variety. So those are what we call affixes. They don't necessarily spell grammatical parts, which are called affixes or prefixes or suffixes, but rather they're attached to the main sign, to the uppercase variety. And these affixes also happen to be rotatable, which is a little confusing. They have the main signs, and some of them are very simple geometric designs. Some of these designs, though, have complex varieties. So here you see Hish, the eye, the sparkly eye of a magical jaguar. So technically, the full form is still the head of that jaguar, but you can use just the eye because no other creature has the same kind of eye. So that eye stands for the jaguar, the magical jaguar, the Hish jaguar, sort of parse pro total approach. A looks like 3 dots, but that's actually an ear hole of a turtle. There is a full version, but curiously doesn't really stand for A. It's just turtle. No, probably comes from cotton, although that's not as obvious from the look of the sign, at least not to our eyes. Some main sign contain 2 elements in the same way as, say, English would have letter C and letter H and then CH. CH is what we call a digraph. Together, these letters actually function as a different letter, right? Letter C, letter H, suddenly you have a letter Ch. So Maya digraphs pretty much function in exactly the same way. So all of these characters alone, when they're not paired, are something else. So we have quite a few of these digraphs. Then some characters are more visually transparent, say signs which look like body parts, hands, and some of them, especially verbs, they seem to show the act. Right? Chok is to scatter drops, tsuts is to close, hul is to arrive, which doesn't look transparent to a Western observer, but actually shows a hand pointing at a new moon, or I mean, growing moon. So that's pretty much the idea, right? Arriving, according to the Maya, or hand biting a jade. Kal actually means to bind, but hand with a shell means nothing, curiously so. And then there are a lot of head signs. Most of them are logograms, but not necessarily so. A lot of syllables have a head variant, sort of like the uppercase fancy variant. Names of gods, as you can imagine, most of them are head variants. Maya head variants look either like young heads, that's the upper row here, the middle-aged, and then really old heads. And you see that they're old because they're wrinkled and they lack some teeth. And there are plenty of animals, a lot of mammals. Those are hard to set apart. It takes some practice to see the difference between a raccoon, ahem, dog, or coati, or aguti, sorry, oak, pisote, cheek, and coati, at least coati has a slightly different ear. So that is a bit of a challenge, and it seems that the Maya scribes themselves sometimes get confused. Some signs follow distinct templates, believe it or not, but the top row shows a tooth. Now, the basic form in the top right corner is a tooth with a jade inlay, or a hole, perhaps, and saliva. So that comes straight from yek, the tooth. But then there's ha, which is a tooth that has some other kind of object stuck in it, a yet undeciphered sign with a cigar stuck in a tooth, a sign chu that shows a chip of wood stuck in a tooth, and ke, which shows a bone stuck in a tooth. Then there's a set of signs which seem to start with the body of water, ha. But then there's also ma and ba and u, syllable. And then signs with flames and smoke, ach, fire, but then also l to burn or to smoke with like incense, ach, an agentive prefix, pull, to burn, like in destroying something. Then also a sign of a flower, nik, which means that aroma, the smell, is pretty much the same idea as fire and smoke. Now, a typical Maya text then contains multiple blocks, which are generally arranged in pairs or in single columns, less commonly so in horizontal rows. A double column would be a pair of blocks. So you read it left to right, and then you go one level down, and left to right, and then one level down, and so it goes. Within a block, the signs are often arranged in a clockwise way. So you start left, you go right or bottom until you're pretty much done with all of the characters inside a block. So, and you can combine signs in a straightforward way, so you can see all parts of them. So these examples are pretty apparent. So mo'o, chukach, mokach, bakab, tup, bakal, tzib, chok. You can also conflate signs because we're in a calligraphic mode quite often. So you combine signs in different creative ways. So it's harder to see distinct characters that way. So the examples below with chok, a word that means young or unripe, and is usually spelled with the syllable cho, which shows a rat, choch, and the syllable ko. So those two characters can be combined in many different ways because you have a head variant and sometimes a full body or half body variant of cho. And so you can do things. Cho can hold a ko, eat a ko, have it in its ear, support it, sustain it, or grab it. So all of these possibilities are there because Maya scribes are calligraphers. They can do it. Sometimes signs, instead of conflating them, sort of merging them creatively, signs are sort of covering parts of each other, forming a kind of stack in which usually start with the signs closer to you and then proceed to the signs further away, in an imaginary way, of course. So an example that you see, upakaptunil is spelled as upakabutun with underspelled suffix, and then also you kind of see that pa is covering part of ka, and bu is covering part of tun. So those are more complex superimpositions. And these are just some common examples, right? How, chi, nal, nab, ma, signs which are commonly covered by, in part, by other signs, creating these combinations. Of course, that homanab example is an extreme case of superimpositions when signs literally cover half each other to form a combination of 6 letters to spell anabi chahoma. And then, of course, there are fancier fonts, what we call allographs, right? That allographs of pads, and ha, doing the planting. These are signs for in and pi, and you can see common variants, common allographs of these signs. You can also get homophones, and just like in English, it gets complicated. Some Maya scribes had the site of Yashchilan, for example, decide that the sign for sky, and snake, since they all sound the same, Chan, to them, they decide that they're just variants of the same character, even though it's not the case. They just lost certain consonants and vowels, and they started sounding the same. And many Maya scribes continue treating them as separate characters. One of the benefits of using logograms. So you avoid this kind of phonetic ambiguity by keeping those word signs. But at Yeshon, they start using them phonetically. And that's really confusing because they treat them basically as different letters, which are essentially variants of the same one. Now, not all Maya texts are calligraphic. So we do have a few examples of really simple handwriting styles on ceramics and murals. But the vast majority of texts that we have are calligraphics. They're harder to make, and they're obviously harder to read. Although that extremely cursive example is also pretty hard to read, just like our modern cursive letters. Over time, Maya signs may acquire additional readings. That happens sometimes when similar signs merge visually, so people stop visually separating them, and they're treated as the same character. Sometimes logograms develop additional readings as syllables, as syllabic signs. Sometimes it's the calendar that stands in the way. So no matter what the cause, we do get these signs which have multiple readings. And you can kind of see how it happens. So say there's a word that means P or peak for bundle. That's a period of 800 years. And there's a word kal, which refers to breaking things, splintering things. And it shows a skull and a rock. So also pretty straightforward. Now, the skull part of the rock is usually covered by a te sign in known examples because the term kal is frequently used to spell kalomte, common title of high kings among the Maya. And so when you spell kalomte by covering the second half of the kal logogram with te, it kind of makes sense that at some point, some scribes no longer know what the full form of kal is like because they just spell kalomte all the time. And they're not asked to spell anything else with kal. So they reanalyze the full form of kal as something that is identical to pik, which they already know and use quite a bit. So that's an example of how the two signs, which are initially different visually, P and kal, converge into a single sign that looks like P because of the way the kal sign is used in writing. Signs also change over time, just like our letters. And that makes sense. And there's a lot of spelling variation in my writing, in part because of calligraphy, in parts because the scribes can. So these are just different ways of spelling the name Kinishana Pakal. It's not just Kinishana Pakal and then Kinich Hanabi Pakala. You can combine logograms in different ways. You can choose to spell half of the name in syllables and half of the name in logograms. There's really sky is the limit of what you can actually do with all these spellings. So, and those examples were not all. You have more examples of the name Kinishana Pakal. And you kind of wonder, how do people learn all these things from context? Just train your eyes. First, you don't have to do it, but that's what epigraphy is all about. Now, I already mentioned left to right, top to bottom, not always. We were actually in Mexico, in Quintana Roo. This panel is at the museum in Cancun, Museo de Arqueología Maya, or Museo Maya de Cancun. And so I took my students and I showed it to them. I was like, look, this is the worst you can do with my hieroglyphs in terms of the reading order. Just make it in a spiral that goes towards the center. So unfortunately, not very common. not the usual way of writing my hieroglyphs. But the scribes do get playful a bit sometimes. So here you have a lintel, but the text kind of wraps around the main character. Here, there is a section that is in a circle along the rim of the altar, but there is also a small part that continues. It's the staff of one of the protagonists that seems to function as a clue to where you're supposed to end and where you're supposed to start. On this vessel from Naranjo in Guatemala, the angled sections help you connect the two texts along the rim and along the base of the drinking cup. Now, how do we guess? How do we determine the reading order of my inscriptions given all of these complexities? The answer is simple. Most of my inscriptions, especially on monuments, are dates. So when somebody's counting days, months, years, 20s of years between events, so using calendar rounds or predictable combinations of words which relate to calendar, it's very easy to establish the order for the whole text, which means also for the remaining parts, which are not calendar. So that makes our life much easier. And finally, there are texts within texts or texts on non-text items. And we'll talk more about it when we discuss Maya writing and art. So here there is a skirt, a book that the person is wearing on a monument, but there's a text on it that says something about the dedication of the painting decoration of the skirt. So this is an inscribed object inside a depiction on a monument. Those are relatively rare, but we also find these. And because they are on objects, the reading order, the location, the orientation of these rare inscriptions can be very distinct, can be very different from what we're used to. So as it strives to replicate the original placement of the inscriptions on pieces of clothing, which are depicted in Maya art. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope that you enjoyed this introduction into the complexity of Maya writing. Don't get scared. We'll cover all of these aspects of how Maya writing works on a sort of letter by letter basis, and how you're supposed to read Maya glyphs. We'll cover it in classes to come. This was just an overview of the script, the way it works in general, and then we'll get into more specific examples as the course progresses through the semester. So that's all, and have a nice day.